Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to the Founders Room in the School of International Service. My name is Simon Nicholson. I'm a professor in our Department of Environment, Development and Health. It's my great pleasure to serve as moderator for today's event. And I will start by welcoming State Secretary Jennifer Morgan. Jennifer Morgan serves as Special Envoy for Climate Change for the German government. Her official title is State Secretary and Special Representative for International Climate Policy at the German government's Federal Foreign Office. Prior to taking up her current position, Jennifer held a number of leadership posts. She was director of the climate program of the World Resources Institute, one of the major environmental think tanks there in town. She served as managing director of Greenpeace International and has done a whole bunch of other things. And she's an SIS alum. Receiving her master's degree in international affairs back in 1992. Thank you. The format for the session today, State Secretary Morgan will speak for 15, 20 minutes or so. That'll give us 15 or 20 minutes for conversation. So queue up some questions. Please, the floor is yours. Great.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Nicholson, and hello, everyone. It is wonderful to be here. So thank you for having me. It's kind of a full circle in a way. I studied here, my studies here in 1989, after having spent the summer in Berlin. And if you think 1989 Berlin in the summer, what happened afterwards, it was an incredible time to study here. I was studying European affairs within SIS at the time. And it was just a disruptive and fascinating time. And in my first semester, I'll never forget Dean Olson, who was my professor for international relations, who wrote a paper on the new paradigm in international affairs, which was the environment. And it was a bit out of the box then, but I would never kind of imagine that in the end of the day, it's in a way what's come to be for necessity, and I'll speak a little bit about that. Also, what's just connected me throughout my life is I understand that Davenport Lounge is still here. I'm very, very pleased about that. So I read a book called Fighting for Hope from Petra Kelly, one of your famous alumna here, who was one of the co-founders of the Green Party and many other things. And I read that book from cover to cover in one sitting, and I can honestly say it totally changed my life. So she brought systems change and all the different things that we need to be working towards very clearly in a small book. I had the chance to meet her twice. She was an alum when she was here. Saved up my money so I could go to a dinner, alumni dinner with her. And I think I'm keen to find a way also to keep her work, which was so important around the world, alive here as well. I'm now a member of a government that has the Greens in it. So you talk about from there to now. And a government that has three parties and a Green foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock. And I have to say, when I was here as a student, I was nervous to even speak to Petra Kelly. And now I couldn't dream that I'm doing what I'm doing now. So just know in your studies here, that what you're learning here and engaging in the policy and political discussions in Washington, it's not only highly relevant, it also can really help prepare you for your dreams of what you want to be doing and shaping in the future. So now perhaps a little bit to my central topics of my lecture today, climate foreign policy. And I have kind of three main messages and then time for discussion. So the first is that climate change is one of the greatest security risks and foreign policy issues of our time. And, when I first started working on climate issues back in 1994, sitting at NRDC, I see Jacob here. This statement out of the mouth of a senior decision maker, well, it would have, I think, been seen as rather radical and maybe even a bit ridiculous. A significant number of parliamentarians and governments in Europe as well in the US, well, they thought that it was a niche environmental concern. Some thought it may someday have something to do and an impact on polar bears. Many others claim that human-made climate change was a hoax. I think, and nowadays, I think these types of assessments from the majority of the world would be considered laughable or even completely out of touch with reality. And just this summer, actually, Germany released our first ever national security strategy. And in that strategy, we recognize climate change and the climate crisis as one of the most serious security risks of our time. It destabilizes societies, it fuels conflicts, and it disrupts peace and stability. And, at this moment, we're living in such a decisive time. We just had the synthesis report of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published in March that made this clear. And I have to say, I've been reading these reports, I've been a review editor, and I have never heard such alarming language coming from a report that is actually even negotiated with governments. They find that there is, quote, a rapidly closing time window for actions to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And the choices and actions we take now will have impacts for thousands of years. And that's now the new era of climate foreign policy that we're in, is what we need for impact and for action. My government, in particular, Minister Baerbock, she chose to bring the responsibilities of climate, foreign policy, and international climate negotiations into the German Foreign Office. It was previously in the Environment Ministry, because she believed that a modern foreign policy needs to respond to the way climate crisis and climate action are shaping our world. And I think Russia's war of aggression, well, it viciously has highlighted the connection between fossil fuel imports, energy and climate and peace, climate security and peace. Germany has certainly learned our lesson. We should never be so dependent on one country for our energy resources, and not to have started to phase out fossil fuels earlier. We've seen that fossil fuel dependency is not only detrimental for the climate, but it also diminishes our own economic sovereignty and our political leeway. And so now it's clear that actually energy security means zero carbon renewable energy, affordable energy, and accessible energy in Germany, in Europe, but also abroad. And that's why Germany and Europe are really accelerated our energy transition to renewables. And also why countries like Kenya, there was an Africa Climate Summit last week, who are really positioning them as climate and renewable energy as their own solution for development, but also in the world, to be providing solutions to the world. So I think at the same time, though, it's also undeniable that the drive to a zero carbon economy, well, it's bringing its own geopolitical implications and obviously challenges. It's shifting the global balance of power. It's changing the parameters that define political and economic influence. The parameters that throughout the 20th century, well, they've been defined by the ability to access and exploit fossil fuels. And there will be those who benefit and those who are challenged by this transformation. So some, like a Mozambique or a Senegal, well, they will need support and cooperation forging brand new development pathways in order to turn their back on their abundant fossil fuel resources, which in its own way is highly unjust. Others, like Saudi Arabia, well, they have their own capacity and their responsibility to manage the transition on their own. And they're slowly starting to look into different business models. And then on the other side of the equation, of course, you have those least responsible for the climate crisis. They're facing climate catastrophes and intensification of resource conflicts. And we all know how it is for Pacific and Caribbean small island states that really are having to grapple with questions about statehood, the nature of their statehood, their territorial rights in a world where they're facing loss of communities and culture, their lives and their livelihoods. So if you look at the impacts themselves around the world, you can be seeing those those interconnections, whether it be, and they have many faces. I was in Tacloban this spring meeting survivors of the horrific typhoon that destroyed livelihoods. 10 years later, you still have people who are trying to rebuild in the Philippines. In the Sahel, I met women who were climate migrants that had come from Mali and gone to Niger due to extreme heat. And they've started their own small farm for their families, but also families in the village that were living with heat-resistant crops. We also have a whole new situation in the Sahel now. And obviously, you don't need to go all the way to the Philippines or to the Sahel to see how climate-related impacts are devastating communities. And it's a very frequent, frightening occurrence, whether it's, we see what's been happening in Libya, you've experienced here in the United States, unbelievable impacts as well. And we see how the most vulnerable communities in the United States, but also all around the world are indeed suffering the most. So at the state level, that means I speak frequently with colleagues, for example, from Vanuatu or from Tuvalu. These two small island states, well, they are absolutely determined to preserve their culture and to find new approaches to ensure territorial rights to maritime economic zones, even when facing border shift due to sea level rise. And they are taking the lead, and they have the full support of Germany and others in their initiatives on that. So that's one piece, the security threat that is here and now. The second, I think, is that climate action is one of the greatest foreign policy opportunities and unifying forces of our time. And that's a big thing to say in the middle of a world which is so broken apart in a way. But what I see is that, you know, when we signed the Paris Agreement almost 8 years ago, those impacts, as I said, then they were almost theoretical to most countries, but now you have no country in the world that's immune to the extreme impacts. And it's so, in a way, it's a unifying force, and it's one that can only be overcome with collaboration. The ultimate prisoner's dilemma that one all learns about when you're studying international relations. And it doesn't mean that there's no competition, that there's no disagreement. But I think that we can find areas of cooperation amongst the competition. So most recently, as an example, we just created a transformational dialogue with China, a country that we are in deep competition with for green lead markets. And we have active and open conversations about human rights with China. But we also share a recognition that the impacts of climate change at 2 degrees will be much higher than at 1.5 degrees. And so we've agreed to accelerate our action on the transformation, especially in creating more flexible grids and infrastructure to increase renewable energy even further. And we've agreed to do that to keep 1.5 in sight. I think climate's also an important bridge in an increasingly multipolar global landscape. We've seen President Lula come onto an agenda of social ecological transformation, one that protects nature and people and treats climate change as a risk to international stability and development. And that doesn't mean that Brazil is no longer part of BASIC or part of BRICS, but it means that climate can be a bridge to finding common ground with others. And that's why Germany and Brazil, earlier this year, we established a high-level strategic dialogue on international climate action and ambition alongside a track 1.5 with experts to actually create the space. And they are hosting, or presidents of both the G20 and the COP in the coming 2 years. So the two of us with our bridging roles, Germany into the EU and the G7, Brazil into BASIC, BRICS, G77, how can we be working together? And there's a great readiness to do that, even though we disagree on many other things. So I think this transformative energy policy underway, it's an opening as well. It's an opening for new jobs, for new green markets and new partnerships. That's why you see a drive coming out of countries within Africa for their youth job creation and being part of the global transition. And I think there is new competition, obviously, whether it be around critical raw materials, local value creation, et cetera. And we see those dynamics around the US Inflation Reduction Act, but that's why Germany is determined to be a shaper and not a taker of the new geopolitics of climate and energy. So that's number two. How can climate be create greater collaboration despite everything else going on? And number three is really working to put a more just and a more social approach at the heart of our climate foreign policy. And I would say it needs to be at the heart of our domestic climate policy as well. You know, the word justice, it's often mentioned in discussions on climate change, and the truth is that the transition to climate neutrality, well, it won't happen at the speed and the scale necessary if we don't make it a transition that brings people and communities along, that addresses rather than reinforces inequalities. And it's just unjust that the most vulnerable countries and peoples in the world are hit the hardest. And by that, I mean losing their homes, losing their loved ones. I've met with many of those people. My first trip was to Bangladesh. I remember the women I met with there who lost everything and their children from climate extreme events. And I think from a values-based foreign policy, which we have, and a feminist foreign policy, which Germany has, we have to support these communities. And so standing in solidarity with them, it's both right and the sensible thing to do, because also if you think of the security perspective, it's exactly those vulnerable communities that are most risk from terrorist recruitment and forced displacement and migration. So bringing together climate knowledge into peace building missions is just one approach that we're testing in the Horn of Africa. And of course, taking their losses and damages seriously is another. So justice and social elements, they need to be at the heart of our conversations with governments about how we catalyze economic transformation to that zero carbon economy, because people actually need to receive the benefits of the transition and not be left behind or be blamed by them. So what does it mean for German foreign policy? Quickly, I think it's all fascinating from an academic perspective, but it's also really critical to the future stability and prosperity of our planet. And so as such, we're getting serious about mitigating the risks and the emissions and seizing the opportunities. We have 7 years to have global emissions, and we take it very seriously. It means, number one, walking the talk at home. We can go more into this if you're interested in the Q&A, but I think being credible in our own transition is the basis of any climate foreign policy efforts. It doesn't mean managing the perfect. These transitions are very challenging, I can say, and it's not, you can't control it, it's not conflict-free, but it means being serious about tackling the hard stuff. We've just gone through a huge debate in Germany about heating systems in people's homes. I mean, when you start implementing this in a real way, it's not just, I mean, Germans have been putting solar panels on their roofs for a long time, right? And being part of that. But when you start talking about your car, you start talking about what your heating systems are, then you really have to listen, and you really have to be, again, putting those social issues at front and center, and you have to have leadership because it gets quite difficult. So we recognize our need to take the lead. We have a climate neutrality goal by not just climate law by 2045 to be climate neutral. And since the new government has come in, we've passed the largest legislative packages in our history on energy, 80% renewables by 2030. I won't go through and all the numbers on that. We're on getting, it's also just things like making it possible to build new wind turbines in 2 years instead of 7, right? And all the different levels that are there. But we're working in each of the sectors to decarbonize and meet those targets. And you may have heard last year that during the war, when we had to phase out all of our fossil fuels from Russia imports, we had to put some coal reserves on. There was a kind of a big publicity about this in some countries of our need to go and have a bit more coal online to make sure we had heat through the winter. So what I'm really pleased is we said then this is a temporary effort that we have to take. And now I can say, well, it really was temporary because we now have new renewable energy power capacities that have fully replaced the coal reserve capacities that were reactivated in 2022. So I won't go into, I mean, efficiency, obviously, absolutely key. The second thing that's key to our foreign policy is that we are making our international engagement and cooperation as effective and consistent as possible. So that means we're building a whole of government approach to climate foreign policy. We're developing, almost hopefully finished with soon with our climate foreign policy strategy. And that's one that thinks all of the issues together. So if you're talking with especially a focus on developing countries and thinking, okay, if a Colombia wants to move away from exporting coal, which this government has said they will, how can Germany work with that country on eye level? So we just signed a new partnership with them for social, ecological, climate, and energy transformation, which goes into energy, forests, peace building, et cetera, and the financing obviously for that as well. So that's an example of how we're looking to forge new partnerships around the world for that social ecological transformation. What's at play in the coming months? Well, we're in a very decisive phase. We have to course correct on the Paris Agreement. We're coming into COP28 hosted in Dubai. It's a decisive moment because I think many of us, I was working for the World Resources Institute when the Paris Agreement was decided. And I know I could say this is historic and worth it because although each country could nationally determine what they were going to do, not like in the Kyoto Protocol, we negotiated where it was determined by a negotiation, but there was a ratchet in the agreement that said, okay, in 2023, we're going to look and see how we're doing. And if we're not on track for 1.5, we're going to ratchet up. That's this year. That's this year. So we're working hard with our allies on that because we need to get that ratchet up, mitigation, adaptation, and finance. And I think so many things to talk about. I think we're really at a crossroads. We still have the chance to build a world that's more secure, that is healthier, resilient, and more prosperous, but we're at that cliff's edge. And so I think the world that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change outlines, which is a world that consistent with 1.5, is a better one, that is healthier, that is safer, more energy secure, but we need to work together to build that world. So let's do that. And thank you very much. Look forward to the conference.
Thank you for being here. Maybe we should begin where you ended. Can you give us a preview into the COP? What are you expecting? Where are we going to get to on big issues like loss and damage, on financing? What's it going to take to move the agenda forward?
Yeah, the COP this year is, there's a number of, as always, key issues. I think starting with the ones you asked about. I mean, last year we had the historic decision to have a loss and damage fund created. That was something I was working on with the Chileans as a co-facilitator, and we got that fund. Now we have to operationalize it. So that means that there's a range of different meetings going on, and we have to decide, okay, what does the fund look like? How is it going to be run? What will it fund? For us, the decision last year was that it will fund loss and damage for particularly vulnerable countries. Now that seems to be up for grabs. And we also said, okay, this is a new category, and therefore the financing, we need to look at how we finance it together with other countries. So the donor base, who is going to pay and what kind of new innovative sources could be coming in. So that we need to get I think we see it as a two-step, really getting the institutional framework there, and then moving into next year on the finances, where we have to decide who pays after 2025 is very important. And key. The finance, we are hopeful, maybe I can say confident, that this year, finally, the 100 billion will be confirmed, that it's going to be met. This is something that Germany has been working on for a long time. We take our financing commitments very seriously. So that's one piece of the finance, but it's only one, right? It's peanuts in comparison to what we need to do. So I think a conversation moving on how to actually shift the trillions is going to be quite important. We're hosting a replenishment of the Green Climate Fund in early October, hoping that the United States will join in increasing their pledge. We've put ours up by 33%. So those are key issues. Along with adaptation, there's a global goal. The big thing you might hear about is, as part of this global stock take, the ratchet mechanism is, okay, how are we going to close the gap between the 2.5 degree rise of temperature and the 1.5 that we're at now? So one of the things that Germany is very keen on is to have a phase out of fossil fuels. We think it's time. Science has been very clear on that. and to couple that with a global renewable energy target, which the International Renewable Energy Agency has put forward. There are different ways of looking at it. You hear about a tripling. We're keen to have a number that's out there, but really moving there, and a doubling of efficiency. And that has to come, of course, with the financing and the skills, et cetera, for developing countries. So that's going to be it's going to be a very challenging COP, but I think one that needs to send those signals because we're so far on the cliff edge.
Yeah, another clear theme out of your talk was the centering of equity and justice at all levels, domestically. You mentioned in Germany, and also, of course, in the international negotiations and actions. We're learning in the United States, again, through the Inflation Reduction Act and various other Biden administration moves, that high-level equity claims are easy to make. But when it hits the ground in particular communities, then things can get tough. And so I wonder if you can speak to the German experience at all, or what you're seeing as you look across the world to move from high-level aspiration to real equity and justice in this transition moment. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, maybe two thoughts on that. One is around coal. So coal phase out. Germany has decided to phase out coal optimally by 2030 and at the latest by 2038. So with some of our states, that's already by 2030, and we're working with others to accelerate it. And the way that that was done was by a coal commission that brought together local communities, labor, business, NGOs, that the government actually set up. This was actually the last government, and brought those stakeholders together, scientists as well, to say, okay, what are your recommendations? And then there was a package deal or a package agreement to get the laws in place, but then to make sure that the states got the funds so that they can be creating alternative economic opportunities for people. I mean, we have the example in Northwest Westphalia already from a bit of a coal phase out a few years ago, which now it's a tech innovation center of Germany. So, but it requires the legislation, it requires the funding, and doing it all together with labor unions, business, et cetera. So, and the experience we've just gone through, I think, on the heating in people's homes is another one we're very much looking at. Okay, once a heater no longer works, so it's not saying you have to take all your heaters out and replace them, which was one of the. You also have to be very aware of how issues get spun by others who might not want the changes to occur. Then what does it mean? What's the level of support that people get? So there's different. You can get up to 70% actually covered of other higher costs covered through different funds from the government, depending on your income level, and there's like the adopters program, you could get even more support if you decide to go for renewables earlier. So it's a very deliberate, it's not, way up here, it's a very deliberate effort to move that through. And if you're working in a coalition government, then it's also an important thing to do because you have to get everybody on board. I think internationally, and then I think there is a very important moment we're in right now, which is how do we build alternative development models with developing countries? How do we not just go for an extractivist model where we say, okay, we want your green hydrogen now. We've now imported all your oil and gas, and now we want your green hydrogen. So what we're working on, and maybe some of you are doing research on these types of things, so ideas are welcome, is what does that look like? So in Namibia, we're working with Namibia for them to both they have massive renewable resources. So they both be using their resources for their own electrification, for energy access, but also then as a new export of hydrogen derivatives or hydrogen over to Europe. But that the manufacturing happens there, their jobs there. And that's what we have to, that's a big thing. I'm not even talking about loss and damage, but I think on the economic transformation.
I'll ask one more question, and then please, if you have questions, we'll invite you to the microphone to introduce yourself and to pose your question. So I'm looking at the title again of your talk, right? So climate foreign policy in a time of multipolarity and crises. I'm going to ask a parochial question. We're at a stage now inside the School of International Service where we've just reorganized into thematic departments. One of our new departments is environment, development, and health.
Right.
right? And so we're trying to be sensitive to the fact that you can't look at environment. My colleague Lauren Cruz puts it, you can't look at environment without thinking about development and health, and think of the connections across all of those different nodes. And so can you help us see that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that makes a lot of, I think it makes a lot of sense when you connect it to what's happening on the ground. So if you want, environment, development, and health, well, what does that mean? It means very specifically building transportation systems that get people to work without massive air pollution, and that they can get where they're going within a short period of time be able to reach their jobs. So, and that's so I think it's interesting that you've put those three together also with the health, because the health issues on climate, there's those types of issues of air pollution, which are just massive. You would know the numbers better than I, but from fossil fuel pollution, but also just been reading a bit, which is also, you have these moments where you read something and go, oh my gosh, I thought it was bad, but the heat humidity index, right? And what it means, these temperatures that are just astronomical, and then the humidity that is also being increased, and what that means actually for health and for death, life and death. So having that come in, and I would hope that you would also be looking at, we talk about the costs of climate action, but we don't talk about the costs as much of climate inaction. So if you have a full economic debate, then you see, were there 18 over $1 billion events in the last year? And in the United States, it's been, I think, has or something happened here. So the costs of the inaction are tremendous, life and death, but we don't manage to connect those together into a holistic kind of development or economic pathway. So if you can work on doing that and publish some things and get people out there, I would be grateful.
Questions? Please come to the microphone. I invite you to introduce yourself and pose your question. Thanks.
Hello. I'm Henry. I'm a first-year graduate student here at SIS. I was curious, especially with moving to greening the economy, renewable energies. How does this play with the new need for sort of lesser utilized resources, rare earth elements? We're talking about lithium is very common, talking about this cobalt, for those that are doing nuclear energy, uranium. And these can have environmental impacts in their mining, and can obviously have unequal social impacts, and can also contribute to sort of neo-colonialist actions, along with sort of how oil can have that same effect. So I was wondering what Germany's doing specifically, and more generally, how you plan on dealing with these issues.
Oh, great question. I think there's maybe just two parts of it. I think the first is that in our, well, there's maybe three. There's the first is, there's more than that. I'll try and organize my thoughts. So the first is, our raw materials policy that Germany's put out there, and also working within Europe, focuses first on trying to research get away from these types of critical raw materials, like to develop things that are much more sustainable. The second is recycling and reusing, and business models, and companies that are now working in Europe to look at that, at least on the battery side of things. And then the third is, if you do need to mine more, which, in order to reach the targets, you see this increase of demand, then that's what I was meaning also by how do you do that in a different way than what we've done thus far. So if we're working with a country to, for example, have lithium as an alternative because we're trying to de-risk, I think that would be my fourth point, from China, and not be so dependent on one country, then how through a bilateral agreement can we be working on the standards, the environmental standards, whether it be water, the human rights standards, looking at land rights, et cetera, that when we're working with those countries, we're doing that together. Also, the tricky part of this is we need to also then be looking at how we enable and work with the country to be able to implement those standards, because that's a different kind of colonialism. Is a developed country coming and saying, okay, we want that, and we want it to do it in a sustainable local value creation way, but then we're bringing our standards in, and that they're too high for them to meet. So then you need to be working through other mechanisms to be, whether it be through development cooperation, to be building the capacity of those standards to be met. And the value creation that can happen there. So we need to do it differently. But there's no energy source that has no impact, and this is the big challenge. But I think we're with Africa and others. I mean, I'm nervous about it in a way, and that's why I'm trying to work very actively in these types of bilateral agreements to get some models out there. So if you see things that are looking like, yeah, that's a good way of doing this, we need those, because then we can be using those in our bilateral and plurilateral, for lack of a better word, agreements. The risk, we just have to manage it.
Hi there. Thank you for coming today. I'm Siobhan. My question is that currently, I know globally, US and the UN do not recognize climate refugees as a protected class, and that globally this has been the standard. Has Germany taken any sort of initiatives within this, or do you see that happening in the future? And if so, would they sort of modify the EU current refugee agreement to help out or support Greece and Italy?
Yeah, there's certain parts of that question. I think one part of it is what we're trying to do in order to avoid. So we are working, for example, with small islands. Tuvalu has this Rising Nations initiative, which we're now next week, we're going to actually co-chair with them to be taking a very serious look and seeing what we need to do to change the laws around the rights of countries that disappear, whether it be their own resources, which they're concerned about, their culture, their people, and what does that mean? And I think that will help inform kind of how we inside also the European Union approach the issue itself of climate refugees. We don't have a specific, there are some proposals in the German political debate around climate passports that some parliamentarians have brought forward about, being a climate refugee and being able to move. So I think we need, and then the other thing is really that, and gets more into our climate and security work, is how to try, obviously, to avoid that happening as much as possible, both through development and opportunities, but then also by thinking climate in your peacekeeping missions, in the security piece, so that you actually can optimally enable people to stay where they are. But I think it's a very sensitive issue that doesn't get enough time. So it's good that you raise it, and one that I could imagine over time, we're going to have more to say about it. So I think we're trying to do things and testing things out. We are bringing together this fall, we have every year a Berlin Climate and Security Conference. The word security sometimes is a bit off-putting because it seems like we're militarizing everything. But that's actually not what it's about. It's quite much more about how to be thinking climate and integrating it into your development, into especially fragile states. How do we get more funding into fragile states for peace building and adaptation and resilience building so that they don't have to move? But then if you look at the numbers of the potential for refugees, we have to get more serious about what we're doing.
Thank you for sparing your valuable time. I'm Vidita. I'm a graduate first-year student from Kogut School of Business and Sustainability Management program. Yeah. So my 3 weeks in the college, we have been discussing a lot about how insurance companies had been pulled out in the California with regard to the climate changes and the forest and everything happening there. So I'm wondering that the whole purpose of insurance companies is to make the laws good and the losses that people have faced. By pulling out from a state or from any local region, they're defeating the whole purpose of having insurance. If they increase premium with regard to having a climate risk in the policies, then people won't buy the insurances. So I have two questions. First, in Germany, how you are governing, how insurances are governed with regard to climate risk, and at international level, insurance companies can be regulated with regard to climate risk.
Yeah, good. Another good question. I think we're testing some things out through an initiative called the Global Shield, which is something Germany, now also the G7 is working on with the V20, the Vulnerable 20, which is how to actually have to support countries and people in countries to be able to take up insurance and the payment schemes, because one of the critiques of that is that then you're just asking people to pay for something that, so how we as the more responsible can be working with countries to be able to get those insurance schemes in place. And so that's just one piece that we're trying out. I think the whole question on the regulatory environments for how companies have to integrate climate risk is something that we need, is not where it, if you understand the risks, either on the side of the physical risks from the climate or the risks for investing in fossil fuels where you have all these stranded assets. I think that's something we need to get much more serious about and look at schemes for that and how to manage the situations. I mean, I think we're still in a situation, even in Germany, where if you have a climate event and then people lose their homes, they still can go back and move into the same place again. And that isn't, I don't think that's the smartest way forward for the future. So how do we create those incentives and the insurance schemes to make that happen? But I think it's kind of one of the areas that there's not as much attention around it as there should be. They're almost like, especially the reinsurance companies are quite invisible often in the whole thing, but they're the ones, I mean, Swiss Re and Munich Re have been companies that have been out there on the front line of identifying it at least, but moving from voluntary into actual legislative or regulatory frameworks has been hard.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Lakeen. I want to thank you for your work and keeping the planet habitable for humans. Really important. I want to thank you for your tribute to Petra Kelly. If we had all listened to Petra more in the 70s and 80s, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in right now. I particularly loved your holistic view and a sense of how the multiple crises we're facing interact with each other, and we need to be addressing kind of the whole package. I'm actually doing a solutions summit in November being broadcast out of the US House on Capitol Hill. And I'm curious to know, we've got climate, democracy, health, and economic insecurity as the 4 areas we're addressing and how they interface. We're going to have the attention of members of Congress and of the White House. And I'm wondering, for our climate day, if you had the ear of President Biden and Congress, what are the top 1 or 2 recommended actions do you think we in the United States should be taking? And what can we as people who live here do? What would we should be demanding from our government that's going to really make a difference to turn this around?
Would that have been an easier question in a former role?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think, first of all, like finally having the IRA in place in the United States, a climate law was just a huge relief, having worked in this town to try and get legislation passed for many years. So I think one thing is just to get it moving, to get the renewables moving in the United States so that it is scaling up, so that it gets to be, I mean, what we're trying to, I would ask them to support a domestic and then a global target to have 2/3 of power generation be from renewables by 2030. Right. And if the US is able to do that, which I'm seeing some modeling that it can through the IRA and others, then it can work with others countries. So one to be supporting them, to work with them to do the same thing. I would say focus in the next 7 years on the renewables and the efficiency and not on the CCS. So carbon capture and storage, if you look at all of the studies, it's going to be needed for process emissions for the like steel and cement and that type of thing. But if you're looking in the power sector and what we can be electrifying, it's not the future. So focus on where we need to be, where we have the affordable solutions now, and the jobs and get those moving in every part of the country, because those are jobs. They're not, and people need jobs. And I guess if I look at, one of the big footprints of the United States globally is its oil and gas companies that are here. So I would be looking at the role that the government can play vis-a-vis those companies. It's a very sensitive debate. But I think, how the US can be also working for a phase out of fossil fuels, because we have to get there. The science is really clear. And I guess for people, I just say get active, like whatever it is, that's how I feel. Whatever gives you passion and energy, whether it's, making sure that there's bike lanes in front of your place so that you can get to work, whether it's making sure your kids' cafeterias have vegetarian options, whether it be engaging your senator or your House of Representative, like just pick one thing and do that. Because I think oftentimes, and I would put probably more effort on engaging in the policy decisions on all levels, because I think we're in a moment where oftentimes, I don't know about, I think it's different here than it is in Germany. In Germany, we have a real discussion about flight shame, right? We have a huge discussion about what each person is doing, and are you doing enough? And you shouldn't be flying. Because of the greenhouse gas emissions, you shouldn't have a car. You shouldn't, and you should be all, and here I don't feel that as much, said diplomatically. But I think so, but I think in some ways, part of that debate is, it's governments and companies that actually have the responsibility and the power to do what's needed, and then people can be doing their piece. So this is a long answer, but there's kind of two parts of what I'm trying to say. One is each person should do what they can. If they have a pick to do something, then it's working to get the legislation in place, working to the companies to be responsible, using their power of their purse to buy from sustainable companies and not from unsustainable companies. And although everybody can play a role, just know that shouldn't be a guilt thing. It's actually the responsibility of policymakers and legislators and companies to be getting the right frameworks in place, but do your part.
That's great. I'd like to invite you to speak at the Solution Summit 2023. Thank you.
We have time for just another question or two. Please go on.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for being here. And also thank you for the work that you are doing, undertaking these negotiations on climate change, because we know that Germany is being very supportive and with cooperative approaches also to seats. My name is Suarez. I'm from Cuba, an international student in the program of development management here at CIS. So I have a couple of questions. I hear you talking about competition many times in your presentations. I think that's in a way welcome, because it talks about a real willing from transition from fossil fuels to renewables, but at the same time raises the question of how this competition is going to be better from before frameworks and standards. How developing countries are going to be better maybe in this competition. Are we talking about geopolitical competition, a competition for resources, a competition for technologies? So maybe a sense about that would be interesting. Also, a second question, if I may, will be related to this part of the negotiation of Paris Agreement. You mentioned the challenge of the GST now in the upcoming negotiations, and also you mentioned loss and damage developments. But are we talking about loss and damage developing in the way of a full implementation of the Wars and International Mechanism? What would be the difference between maybe your government way of implementing loss and damage and seats willing to implement loss and damage in terms of seeing what is missing from the implementation of the Paris Agreement? Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. See if I can remember all that. I'll start with the last piece. No, it's good. They're good questions. I think loss and damage and the Warsaw Mechanism. What happened last year was the decision was to create the financial instruments and a fund for loss and damage. And with Mosaic, the words one finds in negotiations, within a mosaic of everything that's going on. So that means the Warsaw Mechanism, there's the Santiago Network, which is supposed to provide technical support for countries. Taking that into account and what they are doing, but actually what we're negotiating is a fund that would focus just on addressing loss and damage. So, because what SIDS and other most vulnerable countries have said to us is there's a gap. You have an event, it happens. Then you have humanitarian aid that comes, and then you have to rebuild. And nobody's there anymore, right? So how do you finance that rebuilding that isn't just development cooperation because it's been caused by a climate event or what's it called in English? Slow onslaught events, sea level rise, where okay, step-by-step villages in Fiji are being and cemeteries and are being lost from sea level rise. What's the financing mechanism to be able to help to work with a community to relocate or cultural losses, et cetera? So I think right now the negotiations are really around how to create the fund and within that broader kind of set of institutions that are doing some things to really address the gaps for SIDS, but also least developed countries and others. And how do you fund it? And how do you not duplicate? Because you do have different pieces that are happening on the Warsaw Mechanism and other technical support, but you don't have, according to SID, something that's really dealing with addressing the losses itself. And then how you fund it, well, that's a whole discussion I think we'll start this year, but have next year, which is there one proposal I heard is a 1% tax on airline tickets so that private jets and business class might have to pay something and that could go into a fund? Or is it, so what are the different ideas for new financing mechanisms for those massive numbers? If you think about the numbers are just massive. I think on the competition, it's a great question because I think it's this mix of, okay, how do you drive competition so that, optimally, if you do internalize all of the external costs from fossil fuels, well, then you do get, and even now without doing that, renewables are more affordable, but you have competition for markets about how you're going to make that happen. And how do you do that in a way that developing countries are equally able to compete in that? Some of them have way more resources, than resources being natural resources. I think that's the big geopolitical shift that I find is that when I go to South America now, it's like all of a sudden they're potential suppliers of global renewable energy sources because they have so many renewables. I mean, Africa is like, we have 60% of the solar capacity. Germany has the solar capacity of Alaska. And in May we had 66% of our electricity was from renewables. So, and on the one hand, they have these massive resources, but then on the other, they can't yet compete partially because of the cost of capital in their countries and not being able to get the financing for renewables. So the other piece of that, I think that we're trying to work through is how can we be using our AAA rating, our financial instruments to be providing guarantees that Kenya, for example, that's 92% renewables and wants to go further and be a hub for green hydrogen, right, can actually get the investment in because the cost of capital is much lower. Right now, it's like 8 times more to invest in Kenya than in Europe on renewables. Read President Ruto's speech from last week. That's my homework assignment to everybody on all of this stuff from Kenya, because he lays it out incredibly clear. So that's one piece. Another piece is if a country has so much debt from all of these multiple crises, how the heck are they going to have any space to be doing anything on climate? So that's why we did a climate swap on debt with Kenya last week as well. So you need those different financial instruments to be coming through so that countries can be able to compete as well, because otherwise you just kind of continue the same model as before. So there's a number of different moving pieces that kind of have to be put in place.
Do you have energy for one more question?
Sure, one more.
You do? Yep. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for being here. I'm Charlotte Schumacher and I'm from Germany. I'm an exchange student. And my question is, you pointed out that international collaboration is really important, and we need the support of the society, therefore. And right now we are seeing a rise of far right in Germany, but also in all of Europe. And the people do not have the feeling that the policy is made for them often. So what can policymakers change so that they feel more addressed?
It's an excellent question, and one that is relevant for Germany, I would say for the United States, I would say for every country. I think what more can be done? Well, first is thinking those things together. So that was part of my point with the polarization of with the social elements. So if a person who has had nothing to do in any big way of causing climate change, all of a sudden their heat bills go up, you know, they don't have public transport. They're living in rural areas to be able to get into a city. And if they do, it's super expensive. If you're not addressing all those things, then of course they're not going to be supportive of the government or the people who are putting forward those proposals. So you have to think the social issues together. Man muss das zusammen denken. And I think, and that's a policy problem. I always, you know, and I think if I think about the environmental movement, which I've been a part of for my whole life, we didn't think the social issues as prominently as we should have for many, many years. And and I think policymakers also, environmental people who go in with environment, they think just on the reduction of greenhouse gases. They don't think about these issues that you're raising. And so that, I think we're trying in this government to change that. That's why in the new heating law, you see all the different things that are in there. And also in the renewable energy laws, as far as, you know, which households need to pay what, et cetera. But that needs to be the thinking of every government as they put in place, because if you think about the yellow vests in France years ago, right, it was similar thing. But I think it has to go further than that. I think the other piece is to be actively communicating about what you're doing, but also about the opportunities. Because we need to provide the just transition for workers who are in the carbon intensive businesses so that they can, as we discussed, have a future. But if I think about the conversations I have in Germany with small, middle-sized enterprises, with startups, I met this one guy recently. He started a company basically that you can either lease or buy from him, the solar panels, the heat pumps, and he arranges everything. It's for single family homes, so it's not for apartment buildings, for single family homes. He's working on the apartment buildings next. And he's setting it up so then, you know, you can have your electric vehicles plugged in, you can put it back into the grid. He's a multimillionaire now. Nobody in Germany knows this story. They all know about the story of the energy intensive companies that need more support, which of course is part of our debate. But I think talking about all of the jobs and the opportunities that are coming for companies right now, also mid-sized companies, not just the big ones, but mid-sized companies, we have to do a better job of having that be part of our public discussion as well. Because I think that's the transition that's happening. It's also part of a discussion in Germany right now around constructive journalism, which is also very interesting. I don't know if there's anyone here. I did an international communications piece when I was here as well. How do you cover these issues? But I think the policy, the communication, and the outreach. Just the last anecdote. I remember here, Gina McCarthy, who was EPA head when all these rules went through. I remember Gina telling me she was going out to Oklahoma and going out to all these places across the country and talking to people about what it meant. And I think we have to do that much, much more, that they hear about it from us, that we listen as policymakers and politicians, and that they at least feel that they're heard and their concerns are heard, and then taken into account when you're doing the policy. And that means not only just sitting in Washington, that means going to Oklahoma, or going to Leipzig, or going to, you know, wherever it is in Germany, and listening to those concerns and trying to find solutions for them. Thanks.
It is such an enormous privilege to have you back on the campus. Thanks for being here. And my homework is to run up to the new Davenport Lounge and make sure there are lots of copies of Petra Kelly's book available.
Fight it for hope.
Yep. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Say that again. I was like, I know that face.